Ok, chào mừng anh em quay trở lại kênh ĐảoGame. Hôm nay chúng ta sẽ đến với một con game giải đố có từ Android, iOS và hiện tại là mình đang chơi bản PC. Nó có tự tên gọi là PayPal. Nói về con game này, chúng ta sẽ theo chân một con mèo trắng thám tử mang tên là Theo. Và một ngày nọ thì chủ của Theo bị ám sát, mà chủ của Theo là một người rất là quyền lực. Thì theo chân Theo, chúng ta sẽ tìm ra giải đố để tìm ra kẻ sát nhân của con game này. Ok, giờ mình đi theo chương 1 cái đã. Đây, con mèo này nó tên là Theo đây này. Đây là phần giống như phần hướng dẫn thôi, đúng hướng dẫn khi lúc đầu vào game á. Nó sẽ hướng dẫn cho mình chơi cái gameplay như thế nào. Ở đây mình có cái mu, ở đây là nó tương tự như một cái card, và nhân vật ở đây là đi di chuyển theo cái card đó. Đây anh em thấy đó, có một cái card riêng. Khi mà anh em di chuyển lên click vào cái card, nó sẽ di chuyển theo cái card đó. Còn nếu mình đi sai, mình có thêm remove về, mình tua thời gian về để mình di chuyển. Bây giờ nhiệm vụ chúng ta là đi tới hai đứa kia là nói chuyện phía trước kìa. Ở đây mình có 3 cái card để mình di chuyển đây, card giữa này, di chuyển lên. Cái này xem bị camera sao ta. Di chuyển khúc này xong nó sẽ bẻ ngang qua hướng khác. Đây có camera đây.
There you go. Remember, Theo, you can look around at any time. What's that just there? Maybe you should give it a peek.
Di chuyển cái camera để tìm ra mấy cái chứng cứ trên map này. Bằng kích xoay camera. Ở đây là mình đang chơi bản PC chứ không có xài bản Android hay iOS. Thì mình sẽ bằng kích chuột mình xoay. Đây, cái góc nhìn con mèo á là cái mặt phía trước, mình sẽ nhìn cái đó cho dễ. Nhìn từ trên xuống thì nó khó thấy, tại mình xoay cái góc nhìn nó khó thấy. Đây, tới nơi đây. Thế là xong cái phần hướng dẫn. Đây có tiếng động, có gì đó bất an nên con mèo là tỉnh dậy. Mình sẽ đóng vai con mèo này, mình sẽ đi tìm chủ nhân của nó. Di chuyển một card. Ok.
Hearing the yelling from the kitchen, Theo wondered if he had really moved from his bed just to listen to some tiff.
Xuyên suốt con game này nó sẽ có rất là nhiều khu giải đố bằng cách đi bằng cái card này, giữa có những chướng ngại vật rồi tới cái map cuối cùng để tìm được thằng sát nhân để mà cứu chủ nó. Vừa đi và vừa phải tìm những cái chứng cứ trên những cái map này, map khu nhỏ này.
Perhaps things were a little more serious than he thought. The kitchen seemed normal, except what was that he could see across the room? He had to take a closer look.
Đầu game thì mình thấy nó dễ chứ thấy vậy sao chắc kiểu này cũng phải khó à. Tại vì nó là mấy cái giải đố này thường những khúc cuối hay gần ở giữa game nó sẽ có những cái giải đố rất là hack não. Hiện tại mấy cái này đơn giản thôi mà, nhìn mình cũng nhìn từ trên xuống mình cũng thấy biết đi thế nào mà.
His family motionless on the floor. But that was it. No gun, nothing at all. Was someone else here? As he turned away, Theo could only think about one thing. Someone was surely responsible for this, and he had to know who. Cautiously examining the hallway, Theo saw no signs of the killer. Instead, he found a path of destruction carved through strange machines before him. The deeper into the room Theo moved, the more he realized that something was amiss. That bright red light hadn't always been there, had it?
Đây chương 2 laser. Làm sao cách nào để qua được cái laser đi tới cái khúc ở trên đó. Đâu ta? À, nó có cái thẻ quen kìa. Quay là chờ đợi, giống như mình đứng một chỗ để mình chờ cho cái đúng rồi, bóng chưa quay. Chờ cho mất cái thời gian của cái laser kia nó tắt đi ngang qua, đúng không? Ok, đúng luôn. Đi lên. Hai bậc.
What a pleasant surprise. After his daring maneuver, Theo found that he was still alive. Clearly, Theo didn't have time to mess about with the killer on the loose. Perhaps that vent offered a way forwards. Still somewhat tense from his previous trial, Theo was immensely relieved to find no deadly lasers when he emerged from the vent. On the other hand, he was instead faced with a functional, frantic, and quite soggy security robot. As he skirted by the distracted machine, Theo found himself eyeing the hole-riddled aquarium. Either someone was stalking the halls shooting at water features, or the security needed to work on their aim. Still somewhat tense from his previous trial, Theo was immensely relieved to find no deadly lasers when he emerged from the vent. On the other hand, he was instead faced with a functional, frantic, and quite soggy security robot.
Chỗ này nó hơi hắc não nhỉ. Có thêm con robot nữa. Chỉnh góc nhìn từ trên xuống thì dễ nhìn hơn nha anh em.
As he skirted by the distracted machine, Theo found himself eyeing the hole-riddled aquarium.
Đúng rồi.
Either someone was stalking the halls shooting at water features, or the security needed to work on their aim.
Chơi cái này thì tốt nhất thì để từ trên nhìn nó chơi xuống một góc nhìn nó dễ nhìn hơn, chứ lúc nhìn cho con mèo nó xoay mình cũng chả biết đường để mò mấy cái cạc nữa. Có thấy.
Though the appeal of fresh fish was enticing, it was offset by the risk of an unexpected bath. Rather than contemplate such a terrible fate any further, Theo decided to make a quick exit. Advancing cautiously, Theo was encouraged by the sight of another aquarium, this time with the water safely inside, not threatening to unpleasantly dampen his fur. There was no time to fish, however, as security appeared to be taking its job a touch more seriously.
Hút này sao ta? Ở đây có con boss mà đụng tới nó là con nó giết mình nữa. Di chuyển làm sao chướng né nó để mà đi tới khúc kia. Tearing his attention away from the unattainable, Theo delicately stepped between the broken remains of some very expensive-looking showpieces. Despite his lack of any understanding of fine art, he was disgusted by the wanton destruction before him. Having successfully weaved past the searching eyes of the guard, he was overjoyed to see that he could just follow the killer through a door, instead of crawling through the ventilation like a rodent. Theo cast his eyes about the grandiose room, the impressive decor marred by the smoking wreckage of robotic guards. Clearly, someone with no respect for interior design had been this way. However, hanging over the remains of a reception desk, Theo spotted something that took his interest. Bright Paw Industries. Despite the damage, the underlying class of this Bright Paw establishment was clear. The placement of several large aquariums, brimming with exotic fish, was an inspired design choice that Theo could respect. Oh! He wouldn't find the answers to his questions here. Theo crossed the room, breathing in the intoxicating fragrance of fish, while taking care to avoid the remaining hazards. As he did, his mind began to wander. Why was a place like this situated beneath his home? And more importantly, why had these fishy treats not been brought to his attention before? At first glance, it appeared that Theo had stumbled into a storage room for broken glass. Except
there were other items in the glittering fragments. Grenades, missiles, an umbrella. Theo padded behind the guard, pondering his discoveries. A hidden underground facility, robotic security, and now rooms filled with odd weapons. What on earth was this place? Looking back, Theo considered that it was perhaps unwise to leave such destructive toys lying around. On the other hand, there was no way someone would leave live explosives on display. Probably best to ignore it and hurry on. Theo contemplated the ruins of the once magnificent boardroom, which had been reduced to little more than burnt mahogany by some kind of explosion. Apparently, the killer had needed to clear the room in a hurry. But why? Oh, perhaps those lasers were a motivator. With the wall of death slowly advancing, Theo scrambled for a plan to slip by. There, across the room, a shattered glass wall offering a glimpse of escape. Deftly avoiding glass with his paws, Theo found his eyes drawn to a large portrait on the wall. Was that Nathaniel? As he stood, he wondered, how much of all this was his master responsible for? Someone had clearly been rifling through the deliveries recently, though they didn't seem to have found what they were looking for. Obviously, the killer had been looting the facility, and it was unlikely that they planned to use volatile weaponry to spread peace and joy. Being a conscientious cat, Theo knew it fell to him to put a stop to the killer's nefarious activities. Finding himself inside a warehouse, the towering stacks of crates gave Theo some measure of hope. Perhaps the killer would try to search the top of an unstable pile and fall to their doom. Lost in daydreams of the killer being buried alive, Theo stepped blindly forwards onto a conveyor belt, promptly shuffling him away from his happy thoughts. Perhaps he should pay more attention to where he's going. Perhaps it was unlikely that the killer would be ended by fallen cargo. But the belts leading into the dark and deadly machinery seemed to promise an untimely demise. Spotting a bundle under some nearby crates, it appeared Theo's wishes had been heard. However, he tempered his excitement until he could get a closer look. Stepping over a broken belt with great care, he was disappointed to discover not a body, but simply several empty crates bearing the label High Explosive. The empty crates led Theo to conclude three things. The killer had found what they were looking for, they were definitely up to something, and Theo's work was not yet done. He moved on with the hope that the killer's loot would be enough to slow them down. Theo pondered the erratic crusade of the robots as they fired at non-existent threats. Perhaps the killer had just passed through? The belt, unable to tell the difference between a cat and a crate, and lacking the desire to learn, moved him once again as it would any other box. As he headed for the door, Theo couldn't shake the feeling that the strange blue algae was creeping steadily across the wall behind him. Oh well, it was probably harmless. Whoever Theo was following had certainly spooked these poor robots who were all consumed by blind panic. As he carefully padded forwards, avoiding lasers, Theo noticed the most curious drawing etched into the wall. But why would a killer stop to doodle? Ah! Theo couldn't stop thinking about the bizarre graffiti he kept seeing. It was unlikely the killer was taking the time for artistic creativity. Was someone else in the facility? As he stepped into the room, Theo found his racing mind halted by yet another drawing of a slightly more significant scale. Theo tried his best to examine the etching, but found it devoid of artistic value. No, 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 no! Perhaps... No! As he began to move away, Theo couldn't help but wonder who would put so much effort into these acts of vandalism. Was it maybe some kind of poorly drawn calling card? Perhaps, he thought as he carried on, the murderer was simply an awful artist. Whatever it was, the mural failed to hold Theo's interest long enough for any meaning to be gleaned. According to the booming sounds of heavy industry and the massive shipping containers, Theo had found himself in some kind of loading station. Theo's eye was caught by something colourful and clearly out of place hanging from a rail across the room. a discarded tie. Was this some kind of taunt? It was becoming clear to Theo that the large boxes wouldn't just wait for him to cross, so he quickened his pace towards the infuriating clue. Clearly the killer had left this tie to send a message, but in doing so they had left a trail for Theo to follow. Perhaps he'd get the better of them yet. Though he was intrigued by the surprisingly expressive train waiting before him, on the other side of the tracks a curious hole in the wall drew his eye. Perhaps the killer had made their own exit. Stepping onto the train, Theo glanced towards his goal and noticed a strangely carefree-looking robot bumbling around near a control panel. Hopefully this one wasn't a threat. The train began to quake, and Theo couldn't react fast enough to leap off. He had better find something to hold on to. Theo was quite unprepared for the sudden velocity, and found his current predicament extremely upsetting. Luckily, he just needed to hold on until the train looped back to the station. Rocketed past him, Theo pressed himself against the train and vowed to dedicate the rest of the ride to keeping his eyes open for low-flying objects of feline destruction. Have found some comfort knowing he wasn't the only one caught unaware by the sudden departure. But it was all he could do to just keep his paws on the ground.
Theo was quite unprepared for the sudden velocity and found his current predicament extremely upsetting. Luckily, he just needed to hold on until the train looped back to the station. As the hatch broke free and rocketed past him, Theo pressed himself against the train and vowed to dedicate the rest of the ride to keeping his eyes open for low-flying objects of feline destruction. Theo might have found some comfort knowing he wasn't the only one caught unaware by the sudden departure. But it was all he could do to just keep his paws on the ground. Tried not to let the burning robot distract him from his efforts to survive. Theo could just about spot the station, approaching at a rapid pace. He just had to hold on a little longer.
Theo staggered off the train quickly, driven by his newfound appreciation for solid ground and the terrible fear that it might suddenly set off again. Just ahead of him, he could see
chết,
that
lo chơi quá quên mất luôn.
that had sent the train off in the first
Thì đại khái game nó vậy nha anh em, nó sẽ kiểu như gameplay và giải đố như vậy. Nếu mà anh em còn thấy hay thì bấm subscribe kênh ĐàoGame cho mình nha. Cảm ơn anh em theo dõi nha.